Hi guys, Wheelie here. I love making these crocheted charger cord covers. I've had a few requests, so today I'm going to show you several ways to attach the flowers or embellishments once you've done all the crocheting. If you haven't crocheted your cord cover yet, open up the description box below the video and there are links to a couple of pattern videos there for you. I've covered a cord using the simplest of my patterns where the cord is covered and the leaves are created all in one, which makes this a really quick and very beginner friendly project. I've also made several flowers. The pattern for the larger of the flowers is available as a video and you'll find a link in the description box. The smaller flowers aren't currently available as a video. If that changes, I'll include a link to those later, but for now I've written the pattern in the description box if you'd like to try those out. With these flowers, on all of them, I have properly weaved in my tails to stop them unraveling. But then with some, I've left the tails long. I haven't cut them off close like I normally would. I've left 2 long tails on this flower and only 1 long tail on some of the others. But for some, I have weaved in the tails and cut them off really close so they're totally hidden. I've done this deliberately so I can demonstrate a few different methods for attaching the flowers to the crocheted cable cover. So don't worry, if you've already weaved in and cut your tails, that is going to be totally fine. I just wanted to show more than one option because I definitely mix it up a bit depending on what yarn I'm using or how much of a rush I'm in if I'm giving a cord cover as a last minute gift. As well as my flowers and my covered cord, I've got some of the yarn I use to cover the cord, this green cotton yarn. I also have some normal sewing thread. I didn't have any green thread, so I'm using this sort of ivory color, but if you have thread that's the same color as your leaves or your cable cover, that would be the better option. I also have needles. I have a big-eyed needle, which I will use when I'm working with the yarn, and I have a small-eyed sharp sewing needle, which I'll use when I'm working with the thread, and I have my snippy little scissors, which I will snip with. Most of the time I sew my flowers onto the cable near a leaf. That's partly because I think it looks cute with the leaf peeking out from behind the flower, and it's partly because the leaf gives me a bit of space to hide the stitches or knots from attaching the flowers, but you can definitely position your flowers on these open stretches of cable too. I'm going to show you how to do that as well. The first method uses sewing thread and a flower with the tails weaved in and cut off close. I'll thread my needle. This is the first method I'm showing because it's actually the easiest, but I figure a lot of people don't have needle and thread around. Just because you crochet doesn't mean you sew. Don't worry, I'll be using yarn to attach some of the other flowers. I like to double up the thread and then I hold the 2 ends together and tie a couple of knots, one on top of the other. I'm quite clumsy with it today. Thread feels so fine after crocheting with yarn. So that's 2 knots tied to secure my thread. I'm going to attach my thread to the flower. I use the back of the flower so that the stitches will be hidden. I don't tend to sew to this central part of the flower. This bit tends to be a lot harder to get the needle into, particularly because I crocheted quite tightly and I used cotton. So I'll mainly keep my stitches in the purple part, but I'm going to stay as close as possible to the white. So I've just gone under a little bit. I'm going to snip off some of that extra thread after the knot. Don't cut it off too close or the knot will unravel. Okay, that's neater. I don't want to pull too hard on this. Even though there's a knot at the end of my thread, it could easily slip through the crochet if I put too much pressure on it. So to attach it more securely, I make just a small stitch backwards. But I don't pull the thread all the way through. I leave this nice loose loop. Slip the needle through the loop and take it out the other side and pull it tight. Oh, it keeps catching on the pedal. I'll show you that again, hopefully with less catching on the pedal. It actually works better with 2 stitches in a row anyway. I make a small stitch, but stop when there's still a loop of thread. Put the needle into the loop and take it out the other side. Tighten up the loop and the thread is securely attached and you can't see those stitches from the front. I'm going to sew this onto the charger cover near this large leaf. I have the front of the leaf facing me, but I want the back of the flower against the front of the leaf. You could pin the flower in place before you sew, but I'm not too stressed if it moves around a little. It doesn't need to be in a precise spot. I just want it close to the base of the leaf. Be careful that you do not sew through the cable itself or nick it with a sharp needle. Keep your stitches in the crochet. I'll just put the needle straight through to the back. I'll turn it over so I can see. Stitch back down through the leaf and the flower. Turn it back over. I pull on my needle and push the flower so the flower is firmly against the leaf. Now I want to stitch back down, but I don't want to make a big visible stitch on the top of my flower. So I go sideways, sort of through the crochet stitch and down back out into the leaf again. If you used green or whatever colour that matches your leaves, you wouldn't have to worry about hiding the stitches on the leaf. And even in this ivory, they barely show, but I'll try to hide them a bit by only having a little stitch visible, taking the needle down at an angle so most of the thread is hidden instead of making big stitches on the surface. I've come up just by accident inside the central bit of the flower, so I'll just carefully take the needle down at an angle so no stitch shows. You don't need that many stitches to secure the flower, just go around this little central area and back to where you started. Maybe overlap the start with one stitch. I'm going to leave you to do the stitching and I'll skip ahead to show you how to finish off. To finish, I'm going to tie that same kind of little knot I attached the thread with, but I want it to be hidden between the leaf and the flower. So I'll stitch over to here. Make a little stitch, but don't pull the thread through completely, so there's a loop. Put the needle through the loop and then tighten it up. Instead of this knot, you could just overstitch a couple of times. Snip the thread and you're done. So that's method 1. The flower is very securely in place and the stitches joining it are very hard to see. Method 2. The advantage of this method is you don't have to attach the yarn to the flower before you sew the flower to the leaf. The disadvantages are you need to plan ahead and leave a tail on the flower, and your yarn is probably a different colour from the leaf, so you'll have some visible stitches. I prefer to use a tail from the centre of the flower because we're joining the centre of the flower to the leaf. You could use a tail from the petal and bring it down to the centre if you prefer. You do need to properly weave this in before you start sewing. I didn't just cut my yarn, I cut my yarn, threaded it on a needle, sewed back and forth 3 times. So the stitches in this flower, the magic circle, they're secure. The flower won't unravel. Start by threading the tail onto your needle. If you have trouble threading yarn, I have some really foolproof tricks for threading even really fat yarn. There's a link on screen now and in the description box. You honestly won't ever need to struggle to thread a needle again. I'm attaching to a leaf again. All I do is sew down into the leaf, close to where it joins, here. I think it would look really silly to sew it up here on the edge. Again, be careful not to pierce or nick the cord itself. Just straight down through the middle from the front of the leaf to the back. Let's look at the back. The main thing to be aware of when you're doing this is that you have this quite thick yarn that is a different colour from the leaf. So try to hide your stitches inside the crochet stitches. There will be some visible stitches, but we'll make it as little as possible. So I stitch down through the leaf and into the flower, but not through the flower. I want to just catch a little bit of the flower so it won't be visible from the front. You can't really see much of that stitch, even though it is in a different colour. And there's nothing to see on the petal. From here, I go into the leaf. Then back through the leaf and into the flower, not all the way through the flower, just catching a little bit of it. Just keep going around until it's firm. I'll leave you to do that and jump ahead to where I finish off. I'm back around to where I started now. I'll do one more stitch overlapping the first stitch. To fasten off, you can do exactly what I did with the sewing thread, or you can do more like the usual crochet weaving in. That's what I'm going to do. So I go into the green one more time to get me to the back of the leaf where I'm going to hide my weaving in. To weave in, I sew 3 times, back and forth, so there's no way the yarn can wriggle its way free. Just checking I can't see it from the front. That's once, head back, twice. This is so stiff. Cotton and a big needle gives my fingers a workout. I'm just going to thread it again so I can do the third stitch. That's 3 times. Cut it off really close. So that's the second method. There are no visible stitches on the flower. From the back, you can see some of my stitches, but it's not noticeably messy. People aren't going to exclaim in horror. I quite like this method. Method 3 also works with yarn from the flower, but this time you'll need to leave 2 long tails after weaving in your flower. I've left the tail from the magic circle and the tail from the colour change. The advantage of this method is that it is super quick and easy. The disadvantage is that while if you do it well, it will be secure, it does rely on knots, and poorly tied knots can slip free. If you're using a slippery yarn, don't use this method. I'm attaching to a leaf, thread one tail and pull it through the base of the leaf. I'm going slightly to one side, don't go right through the center this time. Slip the yarn out of the needle and thread the second tail. Go through the leaf again, 1 or 2 stitches over, not through exactly the same spot as the first tail. Having a bit of space between the 2 tails will make it more stable. Make sure the flower is right up against the cord and tie a knot. And tighten that knot up really well. Then tie a second knot and tighten it. Snip your tails off, close but not so close that the knot unravels. There. This method is so quick and it's perfect for people who hate sewing. For method 4, I've got a flower that's had all of the tails weaved in and cut off, and I'm going to use the yarn I covered my cord with. The advantage of this method is that by using yarn that matches the leaf, I won't have to worry so much about stitching carefully. The green stitches will disappear into the leaf. This method isn't quite as quick as method 3 because I'll do some sewing, but if you wanted to, you could use this matching coloured yarn and basically do what I did in method 3. I hope that makes sense. There are so many variations on each of these methods. I have tried to show a bit of a range, but I didn't want to make a 3-hour video just on sewing flowers to a cord. Start by attaching the yarn. You can use the same method we used to weave in tails, so back and forth 3 times. The downside of doing that is the leaf can get quite bumpy with stitches from attaching the yarn and sewing the flower on and weaving in, all in quite a small space. The other method for attaching the yarn uses a knot. Knots can also be bumpy, so pick your poison, I guess. I like a knot because it's so quick. I pop my needle through the leaf from the back of the leaf to the front this time, and I pull the yarn through but leave a tail hanging loose at the back. Grab the flower. I'm going to keep my stitches hidden on the underside of the flower, and I'm going to stitch around this central part of the flower. I find it's easier to sew to the petals because the center around the magic circle is hard to get the needle into, so I'll keep my stitches in the purple bit at the back. Don't accidentally pull too hard or you'll pull the tail through. Remember, it's not attached in any way yet. Sew straight back down into the leaf, quite close to the first stitch. You want the flower to be right against the leaf so it's not going to flop around. Hold the flower and pull on the tail and the working yarn so the flower will be nice and flat up against the leaf. From here, I'm just going to sew around that circle in the center of the flower, just catching a little bit of the flower, but not worrying too much about my stitches showing on the leaf. It's a bit easier than working with the tail from the flower because I only have to worry about my stitches showing on the flower. I'm not worrying at all about the leaf. I can make quite big stitches. Good, I can't see that from the front. Just keep going like this, stitch all the way through the leaf, but only catch a little bit at the back of the flower so the green yarn won't show from the front. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. I want to show you something that I do when I work with green yarn, which I don't do when I sew the flowers on with their tails. I didn't position my flower super well. As I sewed around, it ended up hanging off the edge of the leaf a bit. It looks fine from the front, but I wouldn't want it to flap around. When you're sewing with yarn, you can't really stitch to this smooth wrapped side of the cord, but because this yarn is a match, I can do this. a big stitch down into the top of one of the stitches from wrapping the cord, into a bit of the flower as well. Just checking it's not showing at the front. Do you see that my stitch actually wrapped around the cord, but it's just sort of disappeared into the crochet? You can do more of this kind of stitch if it's needed. Just be careful, as I keep saying, not to stick your needle into the cord itself, just into the crochet around it. From here, I'm back to stitching around the middle of the flower, going all the way through the leaf, but only catching a little bit at the back of the flower with my stitches. I'll jump ahead again to show you how to finish off. I've sewn once around the flower, so I'm ready to fasten off. If you started by securing your yarn to the leaf by weaving it in, you need to finish by weaving in this tail and cutting it off really close. If you started by leaving a loose tail hanging, like I did, we're going to finish by tying a knot. Sew up close to the loose tail and tie one knot, tighten it up, then tie a second knot, tighten it up, cut that off close but not so close the knot comes unraveled. I like this method. It's the method I use most often because it's quite neat and I always have yarn and a yarn needle to hand. I don't have to dig out my thread and sewing needles. Because we actually sew around the flower, it's really secure, but using a knot to tie the ends means it's a faster method. I think it's the best of both worlds. From the front, you shouldn't be able to see much, and at the back, the stitches and the knots are camouflaged because they match the leaf. For method 5, I'm going to show you how to attach a flower to the cord cover on one of the open stretches. I'll use one of these smaller flowers because to me, the bigger flowers look a bit too big just sitting on the cable. I don't have a pattern video for these flowers, but I have written a pattern in the description for you. We're going to go back to using sewing thread. I've threaded my needle in the same way with double thread and a knot at the end. I'm attaching the thread to the back of a flower. I make a small stitch. I sew into the flower, just catching a little bit of the yarn, not going right through to the front. Remember, this knot could slip through the yarn, so I secure it further by making a small stitch and slip my needle through the loop. You could also just make 2 small stitches on top of each other if you prefer. I'll snip off a bit of the tail to neaten it up. Now the thread's attached, I can sew the flower to the cord cover. There's nothing that different about this. First, I go through the top of one of the stitches that wraps the cord. I'll turn this over so I can see what I'm doing. So I want to position my flower as best I can so that the middle of the flower is over the cord so it will be stable. Pull on the thread a bit to make sure the flower is right up against the cord. I'll stitch down through the next crochet stitch along. And I'll just catch a bit of the flower this time rather than going straight through it. Wriggle the flower down so it is sitting right up against the cord. Then I'll stitch into the cord cover again. Then into a bit of the flower. I'm trying to hide my stitches. Now we've come to the rounded side of the cord. When we were using yarn, you can't really sew through this bit, but with thread, you can. Use the sharp needle to split the yarn. I'm not going under the yarn. I'm not catching a whole piece of yarn on my needle. I'm going into it through the middle of the yarn. Make sure you go through several pieces of yarn with each stitch. If you just go through one piece of the yarn, you could easily break it. Going through a few spreads the pressure and should be fine. Then it's more of the same. Drop the needle, or don't do that bit if you prefer, just hold on to your needle. I'll go into the cord cover again. I keep saying it, but this is where it would be really easy to poke into your cable with a needle, so please don't do that. That would be bad. I am definitely going through the crochet, nothing else. So just stitch around until you're back to where you started, or you can go around twice if you don't feel the flower is firmly enough attached. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and come back to show you how I fasten off. I'll fasten off by sewing into the flower. Then make a little stitch but leave a loop. Pop the needle into the loop and tighten up, and cut the thread. Attaching small flowers on some of the empty stretches of cable lets you spread out your flowers more. Using sewing thread is my preferred method. There's so little space to work in, so the fineness of the thread is a big advantage, and the stitches don't show much even when I don't use matching thread. But there is another method for attaching small flowers to the open stretches of cable. You'll need some of the yarn you use to cover the cable. I've cut myself a piece of this green, thread it on your needle and sew through the top of a stitch from the back to the front. Don't pull the yarn all the way through, leave a loose tail hanging at the back. Grab your flower and make a big stitch on the back of it. The front and back look quite similar on these, but this is the back. I don't want this stitch to show from the front, so I'm not going all the way through the flower. I'm making a wide, shallow stitch. Sew back into the stitches at the top of the cord. Don't sew back through the same stitch. Space it out. That will make it a bit more stable. My thread is coming out from this stitch, so I'll go back down through the one next to it. Pull the yarn through, but remember that the tail is loose, so don't pull too hard or you'll just pull the tail through and have to start over. Hold on to both ends of the yarn and give them a bit of a tug to make sure the flower is solidly against the cable. You could just tie a knot at this point, but I think the flower isn't going to be steady enough. It will wobble around, so that it'll be a bit more secure. I'll stitch back into the flower. I'll go back through where I first stitched and into just a bit at the back of the flower so my stitch won't show from the front. And back out through the cord. And say it with me, don't sew through the cable itself, just through the yarn cover. I'm sorry if I'm being way too repetitive. Okay, I want to stitch over to where the other tail is coming out. I'm making this look so hard. I nearly took my camera out. Now I can slide my needle off the yarn and tie these two ends together twice. I'll tighten up each knot as I go. I can trim this off, but not too close or the knot will come undone. So that's the final method. The knot doesn't really show because it's the same colour as the yarn around the cord and the flower is nice and steady. I hope one of these methods will work well for you. You can also mix and match the techniques to find a way that you like. I'd be interested to know what you decide to do or which method you find easiest. If you don't feel like chatting, it would be super helpful to me if you could hit the like button on this video. Thank you for that, and I hope I'll see you again soon.